Everything you've heard about Venezuela tells you the same story. The government printed money, oil prices collapsed, people suffered. That story is true, but it's not the whole story, because the mechanism that actually trapped Venezuela's private wealth, the thing that made it impossible to get your money out, even if you saw what was coming, wasn't hyperinflation. It wasn't the oil price crash. It wasn't Chavez. It wasn't Maduro. It was a single night session of a legislature. December 2010. A room full of politicians voting on laws most Venezuelans had never read. Laws with bureaucratic names. Laws that sounded like financial regulation. And what passed that night set a trap that would take 5 years to fully close and a decade to fully understand. This is not a story about socialism versus capitalism. It's not a story about oil. It is a forensic examination of a specific legal architecture, documented in U.S. State Department investment records, Cambridge University press research, and U.S. federal court filings that dismantled private wealth step by step with paperwork. Here is the question this video will answer. If you held $72 million in U.S. Treasury bills, not in bolivars, not in Venezuela, in American government bonds in American accounts, could a foreign government take them? The answer is documented in U.S. federal court records, and it will tell you something very precise about what it actually means to own something. To understand December 2010, you have to understand what Venezuela was before it. In the 1970s, Venezuela's per capita income rivaled Spain and Italy. Not comparable, rivaled. This was not a struggling country that stumbled into crisis. This was the wealthiest economy in Latin America. It had a functioning banking sector, a professional middle class, private oil ventures operating alongside state infrastructure. It had, by any measure of the era, the foundations of a modern economy. By 1999, Hugo Chavez had won the presidency on a promise of Bolivarian revolution. Within months, a new National Constituent Assembly dissolved Congress and the Senate, eliminating the primary mechanisms of legislative oversight. The architecture began there, not with guns, with a vote. 2001, the new hydrocarbons law required a minimum 51% state stake in all oil ventures. Foreign energy companies renegotiated, stayed, absorbed the change. They did not yet understand that the first law was not the trap. It was the announcement that traps were coming. In February 2003, the government established CADIVI, a currency control board regulating all access to foreign exchange. Dollars could enter Venezuela. They could not legally leave. That distinction, entering but not leaving, is the foundation of everything that follows. Ricardo Hausmann at Harvard Kennedy School had begun documenting warnings about fiscal fragility and PDVSA revenue diversion as early as 2002. The IMF raised concerns in its Article 4 consultations about over-reliance on oil revenues and escalating fiscal deficits. Nobody in power was listening. Or perhaps, more precisely, the right people were listening very carefully. 2007 arrived with a sequence of announcements. January. Chavez received an 18-month enabling law, the legal right to pass decrees without National Assembly approval, used to advance what he called 21st century socialism. February, Decree 5200, the Orinoco Oil Belt nationalization. PDVSA would hold a minimum 60% stake in all joint ventures. May, Sidor, the country's largest steel mill, expropriated. ConocoPhillips refused Venezuela's compensation terms. They left and immediately filed for international arbitration at ICSID, the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes. They had already decided that the Venezuelan legal system was not the right venue for this fight. We will come back to that decision. September 2011, the Ley Orgánica del Oro. Venezuela reserved all gold exploration and exploitation to the state. Private gold trading was effectively made a criminal enterprise. Rafael Garrido ran a jewelry store in Caracas. In 2010, a year before the gold nationalization law, the government expropriated his store and the surrounding buildings. The official justification, The buildings were historic and should not be occupied by businessmen. His documented reaction, "We don't know what we can do. It seems that here there are no rights." His gold was inside the store. The building went, the gold went with it. By the end of 2010 alone, the U.S. State Department's investment climate statement documented 537 properties and businesses seized. Irregular seizures, what the legal record called vías de hecho, outside normal judicial procedure, had jumped from 13 cases in 2005 to roughly 300 by 2009. And then came December. December 2010. Here is what most accounts of Venezuela's collapse do not tell you. Between December 17th and December 31st, 2010, Venezuela's outgoing National Assembly held what became known as the Marathon Session. It was a lame duck legislature. An election had shifted the balance of power, and the sitting representatives had a narrow window before the new assembly took control. In that window, they passed two laws: the Banking Sector Institutions Law and the Insurance Activity Law. These names are deliberately boring. That is part of the story. What the Banking Sector Institutions Law did, in practical terms, was give the government legal authority to intervene in, restructure, or dissolve any banking institution deemed to present a risk to financial system stability, a phrase that could be applied to almost any institution at any moment the government chose. Credit flow became a state-controlled variable. Capital movement was legally immobilized. The trap had been set. In June 2010, the government had already nationalized Banco de Venezuela for $1.2 billion. But the marathon session was different. Previous nationalizations targeted specific institutions. The new laws gave the state the legal infrastructure to move against the entire sector, without having to nationalize anything explicitly. The architecture didn't look like a trap. It looked like financial regulation. Jorge Giordani, Chavez's own planning minister, later acknowledged that approximately $20 billion had been lost through fraudulent CADIVI currency requests by ghost companies. The system designed to manage foreign exchange had become the primary mechanism for moving money out. If you were the one running it, private investment as a share of GDP, 15.9% in 1998. By 2018, 2.1%. Not because investors left, because the legal architecture made sustained private investment impossible. The oil price shock came in 2014, from roughly $100 per barrel to roughly $40. And here something needs to be said clearly. GDP contraction, oil production decline, and hyperinflation all preceded the first U.S. sectoral sanctions of 2017. Oil production had already fallen from 3.2 million barrels per day in 2013 to below 2 million before major sanctions were imposed. The external pressure arrived after the structure was already failing. Jo-Marie Burt at George Mason University documented economic mismanagement and corruption at the top as the fundamental driver, not price fluctuations alone. By 2016, annual inflation exceeded 274%. By 2017, 863%. And then came December 11, 2016. On December 11, 2016, the government recalled the 100 Bolivar note, the largest denomination in circulation. At the moment of recall, that single note represented 48% of all physical cash in the country. The replacement notes had not arrived. 48% of Venezuela's physical currency disappeared overnight by announcement. This was not hyperinflation abstractly eroding purchasing power over months. This was the government removing the physical object money had been printed on, faster than any replacement could reach the public. People stood outside banks. Tellers looked at them. Nobody had an answer. The cash was simply gone. Maria Teresa Clemente had spent decades as a schoolteacher in Caracas. Her pension, the accumulated result of a career in state service, was destroyed by hyperinflation. She took side jobs in sewing and hairdressing to pay for utilities that failed regularly. She documented a community in which families could no longer afford funerals and had to solicit donations for burials. Her choices in those years are worth examining as history, a window into how people actually behaved when familiar systems broke down, not as a prescription for any situation today. Central bank records put 2018 annual inflation at 130,000%. The National Assembly's Independent Index recorded 1.7 million%. Both figures are sourced. Both are disputed. The truth is, they are measuring the same catastrophe with different methodologies, and the difference between them is itself a measure of how far beyond any prior framework the situation had traveled. By 2018, a minimum wage worker in Venezuela earned approximately $2 per month at the parallel exchange rate. 1 troy ounce of gold traded at roughly $1,280 on international markets. That means a Venezuelan minimum wage worker would have needed approximately 640 months, 53 years, of full salary to purchase a single ounce. In 2012, that same calculation had required 6.5 months. And I find something in this worth pausing on. The bolivar didn't simply weaken. Venezuela redenominated its currency 3 times between 2008 and 2021, removing 14 zeros in total. The unit of account was rebuilt from scratch 3 times, while the system issuing it remained unchanged. 3 times, they printed a new currency over the ruins of the last one. Maria Alejandra Hernandez owned a home in Maracaibo, a comfortable middle-class life by any contemporary account. As hyperinflation accelerated, her home became illiquid. No buyers with hard currency remained in the market. A cup of coffee rose from 450 bolivars to 1 million bolivars in a single year. She eventually migrated to Peru, where she found work cleaning houses and washing clothes. Real estate in Caracas declined 70 to 80% in US dollar terms between 2012 and 2019. Not from abstract inflation, from the absence of buyers who held hard currency. The asset retained its nominal bolivar value. What it lost was the ability to be sold. By 2020, PDVSA's oil production had fallen to approximately 360,000 barrels per day, from 2.8 million in 2012, a decline of nearly 70%. After firing 20,000 skilled workers in the early 2000s, the company had eliminated the technical capacity needed to maintain production, creating a compounding loop with no obvious floor. Over 7.7 million Venezuelans had left the country by 2024, roughly 23 to 25% of the pre-crisis population. Academic research into Venezuela's digital economy documented professionals in Caracas who found a parallel path, earning hard currency through international freelance platforms, work priced in dollars, deposited in foreign accounts, while remaining physically in Venezuela. One medical professional documented in this research earned up to $200 per week writing medical content, compared to approximately $2 per 15 days in local wages. These were not large sums, but they represented complete bypass of the domestic banking system, which by that point was no longer functioning as a banking system in any operational sense. And then there was El Callao. In El Callao, in southern Venezuela's gold mining region, the bolivar had stopped being used for transactions by 2018. AFP reporting documented a child sweeping dirt outside liquor stores, searching for dropped specks of gold. In a local economy where a single gram of gold, worth roughly $50 on international markets, could feed a family for several days, the search was rational. A town had regressed to commodity money, not as philosophy, as practical necessity. Now, the answer to the question this video opened with. If you held $72 million in US Treasury bills, not in Venezuelan accounts, in American financial institutions. Could a foreign government reach them? The Fraiz Trapote case says, it depends on something most people have never thought about. Fernando Fraiz Trapote was a Venezuelan media and advertising executive, La Tele, Vepaco, Cablevision. On May 9, 2014, Venezuela's Junta Interventora, its expropriation board, raided his offices. They seized bank accounts, computer systems, real estate. The board was granted, in the legal record, unlimited authority for auditing and administration. And then they boarded a plane. The board traveled to the United States, to American courts, American accounts, and attempted to seize $72 million in U.S. Treasury bills held in U.S. financial institutions. U.S. Treasury bills, in American accounts, denominated in dollars. U.S. courts documented this as intervention through what the record describes as sham judicial proceedings. The seizure attempt failed in American jurisdiction, but the attempt itself, the fact that a foreign government board could get on a plane and file in American courts, that is what the record shows. The asset was outside Venezuela. It was still contested because the ownership chain that established it ran through a compromised jurisdiction. The asset's location was not enough. Its legal origin mattered. Contrast this with ConocoPhillips. When Decree 5200 nationalized their Hamaca and Petrozuata oil projects in 2007, ConocoPhillips refused Venezuela's compensation terms and immediately filed with ICSID, the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes. They moved the legal claim from Venezuelan courts to international arbitration. They converted physical Venezuelan assets the government now controlled, into a legal claim enforceable against Venezuelan external property worldwide. The ICSID tribunal awarded ConocoPhillips $8.7 billion. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit upheld enforcement in December 2024. The physical oil fields were gone. The legal value was recovered, 17 years later, through a different jurisdiction entirely. Rebecca Hernandez left Maracaibo for Massachusetts in 2004, before CADIVI controls had fully tightened. She accumulated capital in U.S. dollars through employment, used remittances to pay off a 30-year Venezuelan mortgage in 4 years, later helped receive family members who fled. She did not do anything particularly sophisticated. She left before the cage closed. That timing, not strategy, not asset class, not financial sophistication, was the critical variable. The documented record from these cases shows a consistent pattern. The assets that survived Venezuela's legal architecture were those whose custodial and legal chain ran entirely through jurisdictions outside Venezuela's reach, before those jurisdictions became necessary to invoke. The assets that did not survive, pensions denominated in bolivars, real estate without hard currency buyers, physical gold inside Venezuelan buildings subject to Venezuelan law, had one thing in common. They were fully within reach of the legal architecture built between 2003 and December 2010. If you want to go deeper on the primary sources behind this video, the Gaceta Oficial decree numbers, the ICSID case filings, the U.S. State Department investment statements, we've compiled and linked them in the Substack archive. It's there if you're researching this period. Venezuela did not end in 2022. In 2020, the Maduro government passed the anti-blockade law, selectively granting concessions and partial privatizations for 13 state-run companies in food and manufacturing. A partial reversal, not a restoration, a tactical retreat from the most extreme positions of the nationalization architecture. The central bank confirmed annual inflation at 234% by 2022. In most countries in most eras, that number would constitute a catastrophe. In Venezuela's recent context, it marked the beginning of something that could be called stabilization. A dollarized informal economy had taken hold alongside the damaged bolivar system. In some Caracas neighborhoods, by independent accounts, life had acquired a surface texture of normalcy, supermarkets stocked, restaurants open, people moving through streets. And a separate economy, running on a currency the government could not print, functioning alongside the official one. The Cambridge University Press study on investment law and expropriations in Venezuela, one of the primary academic records of this legal period, documented in precise detail how the framework that enabled these seizures was not improvised. It was constructed, decree by decree, law by law, session by session. That record is available for anyone who wants to follow the mechanism through the primary sources. Nicolas Maduro faces active U.S. federal indictment on narco-terrorism charges. His capture, reported in early 2026, has not resolved the legal proceedings. The ICSID case record showed, as of 2024, that outstanding arbitration awards against Venezuela remained in active enforcement proceedings across multiple jurisdictions. The legal architecture that built the trap remained in the documentary record, and the record remained in international courts, long after the political figures who constructed it had moved on. What December 2010 tells us, what the marathon session, the CADIVI controls, the Fraiz case, the ConocoPhillips arbitration all tell us, is something specific, not general, not universal, specific to this collapse, to this legal mechanism, to this country in this period. The erosion of Venezuela's private wealth was not random. It was not primarily the result of hyperinflation or oil prices or ideology in the abstract. It was the result of a legal architecture, built in stages, using the tools of the state, that progressively narrowed the exits until the exits closed. The Bolivar savings of a retired schoolteacher, the home of a middle-class family in Maracaibo, the gold in a Caracas jewelry store, all reached by the same mechanism, through the same legal system, constructed over a decade in plain sight. The assets that survived. A legal claim moved to international arbitration in 2007. A family that left in 2004. A professional whose income arrived from a server outside Venezuelan jurisdiction. The question history leaves us with was for there all of the good network is clear enough. The question is older and harder. If you had been in Caracas in 2003, watching CADIVI introduced, reading the hydrocarbons law, noting the first 500 expropriations, at what point would you have understood that the architecture being built was a trap? And at what point would you have done something about it? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one.